Hi guys, this is Samantha Clark, and this is my research paper for our Humanistic Approaches to Teaching class. The topic that I chose was best practices for teaching English as a second language, so to students of other first languages. We did do a unit on this in our coursework where we were comparing bilingual education to English immersion, and we were considering what best practice was in that case. But considering that I'm going through to get my TESOL, so my Teaching English as a Second Language certificate, I decided to use texts that were from my own coursework, from the library, and from research found on the Teaching English as a Second Language database, because there's some really interesting stuff for second language acquisition. So one of the major things to look at is the fact that since the 80s there has been this field of research called second language acquisition. And through that field of research they have discovered that language isn't just like any other skill. We learn language by intaking information around us, by listening to language, then processing it in an implicit developing system. So we have a developing system in our brain that processes language that's separate from other skills, because language is something that makes us inherently human. Since we're such social creatures, we have developed this whole part of our brain that has created language and can communicate and understand language. So I wanted to pull up this image here. This shows us the input hypothesis model. So basically we start with comprehensible input. So say you are trying to learn German and someone asks you, "Wie heißt du?" You have no idea what they said, but you kind of remember, oh, du means you. Okay, so you intake du as it meaning you, but you have to have the effective ability to do this. So I'm sure we've heard of the affective filter. So if you've ever been in a class and you were afraid to talk in class, or you were too nervous and you weren't focused on the lesson, then you weren't able to intake that input. But if you are in a calm setting and you are ready to learn, you can intake that input into your language acquisition device. And this is where there is accommodation for new knowledge and restructuring of a device. So do is getting shoved into your brain to match with you, and it's matching with all other knowledge you have of German. And you're acquiring that knowledge. And then you can speak it. Then you can also say to someone else, "Wie heißt du?" Because you have now heard it, understood it, learned it, and used it. Now, where the teacher comes in, the teacher can help guide this input to make sure that it is said in a form and understood in a way that is most easily accessible. And monitoring of output. We're not necessarily making sure that students are absolutely perfect with their language, but we want to make sure that we give them feedback. And the best feedback that we can give our students isn't to just correct them. So let's say someone comes up to you and they say, "How you are, Miss Smith?" You would say, "How you are?" You ask it as a question, and it makes them rethink. They take that in as input, they recognize the question, they realize it's incorrect. Then they try to restructure it themselves. Whereas if you just correct it, they might not intake that knowledge. One, because their affective filter has now been put up, because they realize they're wrong, so they're nervous, and they aren't able to learn. But if you question, using the language, they can restructure themselves. So this is that same chart that we just saw, but we see here that intake is an important component. So processing instruction occurs between input and intake of language. So input is we hear, intake is we take in and we try to understand. Processing instruction is formatting input so that it is most easily accessible to students. So let's say you put on the board a passive sentence. You give the students the rule, the first noun isn't always the subject of a sentence. This is a common misconception for learners. It is seen across all language learners that come from all places of the world. So we address that with them. This instruction doesn't have to be in English. Any meta discussion that you have about language can be in their first language. The only thing that has to be in English is the evidence that is being analyzed. So let's say on the board you have the fence was kicked by the horse. This example can transfer to different activities of passive sentences. And now from this point on, students will understand passive sentences in written language and in spoken language. And they will be able to restructure language themselves because the instructor has taught them about passive sentences. Focused practice is where we have drills. So this is when all that's happening is that the educator is saying something and the students are repeating it back to them. I'm sure we've all done that in language classes. This is ineffective just by looking at this chart because it happens so late in the language learning system. We want to tackle the problems of input because it's at the beginning of the system. So now that we've talked about that, we can tackle the problem at hand. So we know the best way to instruct language, but the problem is we're not using it. So our public schools are still using these strategies that were learned in the 1940s, back when Pavlov discovered that his dogs could be conditioned to drool. Well, humans aren't dogs. We have a developing system for language, and language is not a skill like other skills. We have a whole developing system dedicated to language. We've learned that, but our educators are not using that. We still have habit formation in classrooms. And a major issue is in general education classrooms, students aren't often allowed to use their first language. In California, we have luckily finally gotten past that. But in the majority of states, students still aren't allowed to use their first language to explain things to one another, so they aren't properly learning English. So the only way to tackle this is for professional development of all schools and all classrooms.